Hey, good morning, friends. Today, my friends, is Friday, May the 2nd, 2025, and the time now is 7:32 a.m. So, friends, I want to talk briefly about Vietnam. I want to talk specifically about the fact that on Wednesday, April the 30th, Vietnam celebrated the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. Now, it is an interesting event, especially given the current states of international relations. I know earlier this week I talked about the fact that the vice president of Cuba visited Vietnam, and the visit was to extend or to celebrate the partnership between Vietnam and Cuba, the solidarity or friendship between the two countries, and also celebrate their cultural and political ties. But the Chinese president Xi Jinping also recently visited Vietnam, and they did talk about cooperation and all other things. We see what is happening in the world today, okay? Given the current state of the disunity in Europe among the Europeans, we are seeing that the West is fighting Russia in Ukraine using Ukrainian bodies and Western, especially American bullets to fight the Russians, and they are losing drastically in Ukraine. We are seeing the emergence or the rise, exponential rise of BRICS, where multiple countries have made their bids to join BRICS, or they are being given invitation to become part of BRICS or to become observers in the BRICS system. We are seeing what is happening in Africa with the radicalism of African youth. We are seeing the popularity of people such as Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. On that same day, April the 30th, there were protests or demonstrations throughout the world and throughout Africa and even in the United States and Europe in support of Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. This given the fact that just in recent times, one American official, general, came claiming that Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso is using the Burkinabes gold for his own protection and basically calling Ibrahim Traore corrupt and stating that the United States has to go and get him. So the threats that the United States and the West have been making against Ibrahim Traore is galvanizing support and radical support among Africans and throughout the African diaspora. There are African Americans, Europeans, Afro Europeans, okay, Africans in Latin America, Jamaicans, and so on, who are coming out boldly saying that if anything happened to Ibrahim Traore or if the United States invade that country, they are going to go to Africa and join the fight against the United States and the West. So it is very interesting. Given all this, I believe that Vietnam is in a very interesting situation at a very interesting time, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, the Fall of Saigon, on the 30th of April, 1975. It is an interesting event and an interesting thing to observe in the world today. Now, the Vietnamese people are very smart people, beautiful, courageous people, hardworking people, and people who do not take mess. I've watched several comedians, and one specifically who I do not remember his name, but he had a show where he's talking about how you recognize the different Asian groups. And this comedian actually did state, and he made fun. Okay, he's Asian himself, and he made fun of Asian people. I mean, he's a comedian. And he stated something such as the Vietnamese are among the shortest or the smallest of Asian, but they don't take crap from nobody. And he was stressing that the Vietnamese will fight anyone. Doesn't matter how big or small you are, how powerful you are. If a Vietnamese person feel that he or she is being attacked, you are posing threat to him or her, he or she is going to fight back and is going to bust your ass. If you consider what the comedian is saying, even though it is a joke, and you apply that to the fight of Vietnam against imperialism, you're thinking, in this case, the Vietnamese fighting against the French, okay? Kicking out the French to obtain their independence, and the United States taking over the fight against the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese fighting them. It is remarkable. I remember growing up in Africa when we are watching all these war movies and you have the American just shooting the heck out of the Asian. And we developed this concept, which today I've heard many parts in the world, that in the war, Asian people just don't finish. The more you shoot at them, the more they come back or whatever. But that actually, when you apply that to reality, it does show the courage of the Vietnamese people, how much they stood up to fight against the United States and fight for the unification of Vietnam and to kick out the Americans or the Western influence or domination of Vietnam. Now, if you apply the concept of Vietnam to Korea, the North Korean, the South Korean, they are strong-minded people. They fought bravely for the unification of their country or whatever ideology they believed in. However, North Korea today is separated from South Korea, and both countries are at odds with each other, with the United States having many bases, military bases in South Korea. And the prospect of war between the two Koreas is something that many around the world and also prominent observers and commentators on international relations continue to predict. However, Vietnam basically said that no, we are not going to back down. And today, despite the fact that Korea remains divided, Vietnam was able to unify the Viet Cong, those Vietnamese people throughout the country who fought, okay, bravely, were able to reunify their country. Now, in terms of the 50th anniversary, it is a mighty celebration for the people of Vietnam and the countries, okay, the youth throughout the country have been speaking patriotically about the unification, the peace in their country, and the fact that they were able to fight and maintain a unified modern Vietnam. Now, friends, I am not sure how much of a fighting spirit the Vietnamese youth of today have compared to their fathers and grandfathers of 50, 60, 70 years ago, those who fought to defeat the French and the United States. Because, and I'm saying this, friends, throughout the world, we have history in various places around the world where the history shows that the ancestors, the fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers, fought to repel some form of domination by outsiders. The youth basically just come in and throw everything away that the old ones have fought for. However, given the history of Vietnam and given the temperament of the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese culture, perhaps we can say that the radicalism, the patriotism that the old Vietnamese showed 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, or even longer than that, still does persist within the Vietnamese people and within the hearts and the minds of all Vietnam or Vietnamese, whether we are talking about the old, the young, the very old, the not so very old. In terms of the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, okay, and the defeat of the United States in Vietnam, the Vietnamese leadership basically is emphasizing peace, unification, and prosperity for Vietnamese people, for all of the Vietnamese populace or population. Now, it is a big deal for every country in the world for leaders to emphasize peace, unity, prosperity, and so on of their people, their entire population. Vietnam is just like any country in the world. It does have its negatives and its positive in terms of the leadership system. I've heard many Vietnamese even talk about Vietnam is like this, Vietnam is like that. They talk about corruption here, corruption there. And friends, I've even had Vietnamese friends who will talk about the fact that sometimes money flows. Okay, when you interact with people, whether you're talking about politicians or business people, money flows. People are pushing money here and there. People are bribing. It is all over the world, even in my country, Liberia. Money flows. However, at the end of the day, we do have in Vietnam a unified government. Perhaps the government has a lot to learn and a lot to do. However, friends, Given the neighborhood in which Vietnam lives, in which Vietnam finds itself, given the neighborhood of Asia, I think Vietnam is in a good hand because Vietnam does have lots of good examples to follow. China now has the largest economy in the world. It is one of the most advanced country in the world and has one of the strongest military in the world, strong enough to even take on the entire West, okay, possibly altogether as Russia is doing in Ukraine. We are seeing Singapore, okay, which is a mighty country. Yes, it is a nation state. We are seeing what is happening in Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, and throughout Asia. So Vietnam does have huge, okay, pool of great examples to follow in order to continue to modernize itself. And I do believe, given the heart, the temperament of the Vietnamese people, and the will of the government, they are going to continue to modernize Vietnam and make Vietnam a great country, a very influential country, which it is right now in South Asia, in Asia, and around the world. Now, friends, in terms of the symbolism, I find it to be very interesting given the fact that just this week, the vice president of Cuba did made a visit to Vietnam. And both countries being communist countries or countries run by communist government. Vietnam is in another situation in which it is free and it is in a very good neighborhood. We are talking in this case of Asia, where we do have the rise, okay, and the current state of prominent economies and countries, militaries in the world. Cuba, in its neighborhood, is in a weak state where all of Cuba's neighbors and friends and brothers and sisters countries are all weaker island countries, poor or powerless to take on the United States and the West. However, friends, the extension of solidarity and friendship and continuation of solidarity and friendship between both Cuba and Vietnam is great, and I hope that both countries continue to celebrate their friendship and solidarity. Now, once again, the symbolism of this, we are seeing Vietnam celebrate its 50th anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, which basically took place on the 30th of April 1975. And Vietnam is talking about peace, unity, and prosperity. Just in Africa, we are seeing Burkina Faso challenge the rest of the African leaders, corrupt leaders. Burkina Faso and the Sahel Alliance challenge ECOWAS, which is now evident to be a puppet, a tool used and run by the West, basically to sustain Western dominance against or over Africa. And the rest of Africa, the populace, especially the youth, are becoming much more radical enough to speak out. And we are seeing this throughout Africa and the African diaspora as well. We are seeing the resistance of the Russians against the West. Ukraine is fighting hard, fighting the Russians. We are seeing the alliance of resistance in the Middle East against Israel and the United States and the West. We are seeing the possibility of war between the United States and Iran. And given all this, we are seeing the current war, okay, which the United States president waged against the rest of the world, about 180 countries or so. And I'm talking in this case of the Trump tariff war. And the fact that Trump is actually losing, Trump and the United States are losing the tariff war to China. We are seeing African countries basically trying to devise plan to combat the aftermath of Trump's economic or trade war against Africa. Vietnam itself is one of those countries that were hit, okay, with or by the Trump's tariff. It is said that Vietnam was hit with about 46% tariff. All this is interesting. Now, I read one article that talks about the defeat of the United States in Vietnam in the current economic war, which I do believe is going to be a defeat again, okay, of the United States. Now, friends, looking at all this, there are many, especially prominent observers and commentators on international relations, who are going to stress that the United States did lost, okay, in Vietnam, and truly so. That actually prompted me to ask, the war in the Middle East, the taking out of Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, the overthrow of the Syrian president Assad, can we possibly say that the United States actually won those wars? Or can we possibly say that the United States lost those wars in the Middle East? However, if you look at it, I do believe what we saw in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, even though the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, perhaps it was never to spread democracy. It was to defeat the countries and leaders, taking out the leaders who possibly would have been a menace to the United States, the West, and to Israel. For example, I did ask myself, what is now happening in the Middle East? Could it have happened had Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi been alive? Perhaps not. Perhaps those leaders would have formed a coalition to attack Israel. And this perhaps could have been the reason why the United States and the West went after them, basically eliminating the fighters before the war even started. Now, friends, please tell me what you think. However, friends, in terms of Vietnam, let me get back on track. I want to wish all the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese of this channel happy Liberation Day, or happy Independence Day, or happy victory, however you say it in Vietnam. You did won a war. You was able to unify your country, keep your country unified, and you continue to move on in a way that many countries continue to strive for. Now, friends, please tell me what you think, and I really want to know what you think. But friends, I'm going to end here. I want to thank you for being a member of the Echoing Voice community, my friends. But most especially and most importantly, friends, I want to thank you a lot for watching the Echoing Voice. Peace.